Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second uh, part to the John Locke recordings. In this section, we're going to be looking at his sections 14 to 17, keeping in mind that we don't cover 16. Okay, so um, look, we'll jump straight into section 14. In this one, Locke expands on his argument that consciousness is self and that we can't separate these two. The self follows consciousness. And he talks about a possible consequence of this, which is that of reincarnation. What would happen if our consciousness could transfer from one body to the next? And this is where Locke identifies the importance of memory in identifying self. Um, because what he says is, or what he argues for, is that if the consciousness can articulate memories from that past life, then they are that past person, and in the way that Locke uses the word person, okay, to mean consciousness and identity, okay. So the man or the human, the physical form might change, but the person has remained. If someone claims to be reincarnated, but they can identify no memories or speak intelligently about the life of that previous form, then they're not. This is a different consciousness. So without memory, we have no link. And so, yeah. Let's jump straight into the reading. So there's one line on the left-hand side of the page, and then the majority of section 14 is on the next one. So don't miss that one line down the bottom there, but let's get started. As to the second part of the question, whether the same immaterial substance remaining there may be two different persons. Sorry, let me say that again. Immaterial substance remaining, there may be two distinct persons. Which question seems to me to be built on this? Whether the same immaterial being, by this he's talking about, the potential for a soul or, the non-physical mind, whatever we want to call it, whether the same immaterial being conscious of the action of its past duration, may be wholly stripped of all the consciousness of its past existence and lose it beyond the power of ever retrieving it again, and so, as it were, begin a new account from a new period, have a consciousness that cannot reach beyond this new state. So here Locke is saying, what would happen if our consciousness lost all link to previous memories? What would we kind of say about that? And, as I'm sure you've already guessed, Locke would argue that, well, without a link to memory, then you are the same human, the physical form, but you are not the same person. So a good example of this is, a serious case of amnesia after head trauma. You are physically identified as you. People would recognize you after you've healed and that sort of thing. But if you have no memories of your past life, it is a different person and a different self that would be present in the body. Okay. All those who hold pre-existence are evident of this mind. So pre-existence is the argument that souls have existed forever. So what Locke is going to draw reference to soon enough is the Christian idea that God created the heavens and the earth in 7 days and then stopped. Okay, well, in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. But there's been no further creation since then. And so in the Christian faith, there's an argument that souls are not made, they have always existed. And this would then necessitate the passing of souls from one body to another. So hence, this is the pre-existence idea that he's talking about. So all those who hold pre-existence are evidently of this mind, since they allow the soul to have no remaining consciousness of what it did in that pre-existent state, either wholly separate from body or informing any other body. And if they should not, it is plain experience would be against them. So what Locke is saying is any Christian who believes in the pre-existence of the soul, in other words, the soul that is within you has existed in previous forms before, yet has no memory of those previous forms, obviously is familiar with this idea of, well, what would happen if you lost all your memories? Okay. So that's just kind of what Locke is talking about there. So that personal identity, reaching no further than consciousness reaches, a pre-existent spirit not having continued so many ages in a state of silence, must needs make different persons. So again, particular use of words here by Locke. He's using the word persons quite specifically. The soul, it may experience pre-existence. Your soul, if it exists at all, may have existed across multiple lifespans for thousands of years now. But if it has no memory, then for Locke, we must consider it a different person. Okay, particular use of the word person there. Suppose a Christian Platonist or a Pythagorean should, upon God's having ended all his works of creation the seventh day, think his soul hath existed ever since, and would imagine it has revolved in several human bodies, as I once met with one who was persuaded his had been the soul of Socrates, how reasonably I will not dispute. This I know, that in the post he filled, which was no inconsiderable one, he passed for a very rational man, and the press has shown that he wanted no parts or learning. Would anyone say that he, being not conscious of any of Socrates' actions or thoughts, could be the same person as Socrates? So what Locke is saying here is, let's entertain this thought for a moment, and he's talking about someone that he knew who was, quite well thought of and a consequential person in society, who argued that he had Socrates' soul, that he was Socrates reincarnated. Well, for Locke, the key question is, would we consider him Socrates? Would we agree with this if he could not tell us anything about Socrates' life? Let anyone reflect upon himself and conclude that he has in himself an immaterial soul, which is that which thinks in him, and in the constant change of his body keeps him the same, and is that which he calls himself. Let him also suppose it. So just pause for a second there. What Locke is saying here is, let's for a moment allow consciousness to be the same as the soul, okay? Or at least, thought to be, the thinking process to be the same or inhabited by the soul. What you identify then as yourself is your soul. Okay, so that is the core of you. Continue on now. Let him also suppose it to be the same soul that was in Nestor or Thersites at the siege of Troy. For souls being, as far as we know anything of them, in their nature indifferent to any parcel of matter, the supposition has no apparent absurdity in it. So what Locke's just saying here is, this might sound a little bit weird, but if souls are immaterial, then it's perfectly conceivable that they could do this, like pass from one person to another, which it may have been, as well as it is now, the soul of any other man. But he now having this is important, but he now having no consciousness of any of the actions, either of Nestor or Thersites, does or can he conceive himself the same person with either of them? Can he be concerned in either of their actions, attribute them to himself, or think them his own more than the actions of any other men that ever existed? So what Locke is saying here is, let's imagine for a moment that your soul is reincarnated, okay? If you have no memory of that reincarnation, if you're not aware of that, you're hypothetically, you're aware of your soul's existence right now through consciousness, but you're not aware of that reincarnation. You have no memories from a past life. Are the actions of the past life yours as you exist now? Your soul may have been in there, but if you have absolutely no memory of that and no conscious link to it, are those actions yours? And Locke is sort of implying, it's a rhetorical question at the end here, or think them his own more than the actions of any other men that ever existed. What Locke is talking about here is, the actions of Nestor, for example, are no more yours than the actions of any other person, and you are no more linked to their actions than the actions of any other person. Um, so that this consciousness not reaching to any of the actions of either of those men, he is no more one self with either of them than if the soul or immaterial spirit that now informs him had been created and began to exist when it began to inform his present body. Though it were ever so true that the same spirit that informed Nestor's or Thersites' body were numerically the same that informs his. So what Locke is saying here is sort of what we've already covered. If you have no memory of them, your immaterial soul, which remember at this point Locke is affiliating with consciousness, it may have been present in a past body. This is conceivable. If a soul is immaterial and therefore behaves very differently to material substances, then yeah, like this is, it sounds weird, but it makes sense. But for Locke, if you have no memory, then it's actually no different to your soul being created new. It's no different to having a soul that has never reincarnated. If you have no memory to a past life, then there's no difference between having a reincarnated soul or having a new one, because you still have zero memories and zero recollection of a past life. And so even though it may be the same soul, you would not be the same person as your past reincarnations. So for this would no more make him the same person with Nestor than if some of the particles of matter that were once a part of Nestor were now a part of this man, the same immaterial substance without the same consciousness, no more making the same person by being united to any body than the same particle of matter without consciousness united to any body makes the same person. So whilst Locke here is talking about, like, imagine we know that sort of matter or energy is probably a better example. Energy never dies out, it simply changes. So it's perfectly reasonable to think that the energy within your body now has existed in past forms. It has to have. We don't create it. It's always present, and so it simply changes. In this way, are you the the person who had your energy previously? But no, I mean, this sounds utterly ridiculous. And so I think a better, certainly what pops into my head when I read this section of Locke is, imagine borrowing someone's clothes. It doesn't make you them. It doesn't change the self. Okay, so just because you've borrowed someone's t-shirt does not make you that person. Just because, collector's items are a good example of this as well. People fall over themselves to, they pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy a guitar that Jimi Hendrix played. You know what? It doesn't make you Jimi Hendrix. Having Jimi Hendrix guitar doesn't make you Jimi Hendrix. And so this, this is the idea of the soul of what Locke is talking about with the soul here. It may be reincarnated, but if you have no memory of that, then what are we even talking about? Like, it doesn't matter. It may as well be a new soul. So, but let him once find him. So what Locke is saying here is, but what if the memories return? Okay, so, but let him once find himself conscious of any of the actions of Nestor, then he finds himself the same person with Nestor. So we see here that memory is a real crucial linchpin in Locke's Locke's definition of where identity extends to. And so in this way, identity and yourself is something of a fluid thing, in that if you don't remember something, well, then you, as you exist now, you weren't involved in it. However, if the memory returns, then you are. It's a bit of a weird argument. It's got its weaknesses, but John Locke here is sticking to his guns. Self is consciousness, and self extends as far as memory allows it to extend. So he's sticking to that and taking the consequences with it. rather than contradict his point. Okay. Um, so that's section 14, sort of focusing on this idea of, well, what would happen if our soul was reincarnated but didn't bring any memories? Then we're not the same self. Section 15 has an important point, or a important section in it. This is where Locke presents the thought experiment of the prince and the cobbler. Essentially, imagine the soul of a prince one day woke up in the body of a cobbler. It could articulate all of the memories of a prince, but for the outside world, it would still remain a cobbler. And so what Locke is saying here is that the physical body you inhabit, or your consciousness inhabits, is important, but it's important from a third person point of view. The way other people identify you will be reliant on your physical body as well. Okay, and so and this is, again, the distinction between man, the physical body, or human, the physical body, versus person, which is your consciousness. Let's jump into the reading, but remember, this is really the difference between the first and the third person account of self. We always identify ourselves as what Locke would call our person, okay, our consciousness, but others usually identify us by what Locke says as man, or, more collectively human, the physical form that we take. So, and thus may we be able without any difficulty to conceive the same person at the resurrection, though in a body not exactly in make or parts the same which he had here, the same consciousness going along with the soul that inhabits it. So what Locke is saying here is, imagine reincarnation, where the memories and the consciousness has followed the soul into the new body. Okay. But yet the soul alone in the change of the body would scarce to anyone but to him that makes the soul the man be enough to make the same man. So what Locke is saying here is, whilst the person would sort of wake up in this new body and understand themselves as being the same, as in the same identity, the same person, everyone else would not. Okay, everyone else would not see the same person. For the soul of a prince carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, for should the soul of a prince carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life enter and inform the body of a cobbler, as soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees he would be the same person with the prince, accountable for the prince's actions, but who would say it was the same man? Okay, so what Locke is saying here is, if I could actually articulate to you everything that I've done in a past life, people would understand that, like, the person has followed the soul. Okay, so in the example that he's talking about here, imagine that, like any body switch movie, sort of Freaky Friday kind of thing. Imagine you wake up one day and you're in the body of someone else and they're in the body of you. Now, imagine talking to someone who knew both of you, and you were talking as the other person and the other person was talking as you and could articulate that. The person you're talking to would probably agree that you are, like, the consciousness that's within you is the other person, but they would be seeing, in terms of the man or the human, the form, the physical form, they would be seeing you still. And so this is the difficulty with the third person account. Whilst we listen to what people say, and if they can articulate things, we'll see that consciousness. Imagine someone walking past you in the street who you have seen before. Okay, you sort of wave to them, they wave to you, but you don't actually talk about anything. You would assume it's the same person, that their soul or their consciousness has not changed. And so this is the difficulty with the prince and the cobbler. If the cobbler, which now has the prince's soul in it, could articulate the prince's life, then people would probably say, yes, it is the prince. However, they would still see the cobbler. The body too goes to the making of the man, and would, I guess, to everybody determine the man in this case, wherein the soul, with all its princely thoughts about it, would not make another man, but he would be the same cobbler to everyone besides himself. So, um, yeah, Locke is pointing out here the importance of that physical existence from the third person point of view. Okay. Um, he would still be the cobbler to everyone besides himself. Okay, so people would still identify that person as the cobbler. That would be the identity that they give them, but he to himself would be the prince. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I know that, in the ordinary way of speaking, the same person and the same man stand for one and the same thing, and indeed everyone will always have a liberty to speak as he pleases, and to apply what articulate sounds to what ideas he thinks fit, and change them as often as he pleases. But yet when we will inquire what makes the same spirit, man, or person, we must fix the ideas of spirit, man, or person in our minds, and having resolved with ourselves what we mean by them, it will not be hard to determine in either of them or the like when it is the same and when not. Really, what Locke is talking about here is, whilst people use like these terms interchangeably in normal language, so self and man and person, and Locke is saying that's fine, and you're free to use language however you would like to articulate your ideas, but we have to be clear that when we're discussing these things and actually trying to come to a conclusion, we have to stick firm with definitions. And so remember, for Locke, when he uses the word man, he's meaning the physical substance of you. Okay, in other words, your body. And this is the way that other people identify you. Okay. When he's talking about person, he's talking about consciousness. And this really is only ever known to you. You can make it clear to other people by what you say, but it's only ever known to you. Okay. So that's section 15. As I said, the prince and the cobbler thought experiment, an important one. So the prince goes into the cobbler's body. It can articulate the prince's life, and people would say it may be the prince inside, but it's certainly the cobbler outside, and they would identify it as the cobbler. It would be very hard for this cobbler to show up to the palace and ask to be seated at the king's dining table. Okay, so last section for this recording, section 17 now. Remember, we skip section 16, and in this one, what we're looking at is what happens. Let's imagine that the self was able to be removed from the body, and Locke, I don't know, he talks about like a little finger being removed, and imagine that the little finger inhabited, like the spirit or the soul, or we'll use the word consciousness, was inhabited within this little finger. And let's imagine for a moment that the rest of the body goes on to live, and the little finger goes on to live. Where did the self go? Well, the self went with the little finger. And should a new consciousness rise up in the body, well, that would be a new person. Okay. So I don't know why he chose a little finger. Like, I feel like, although it's as good as cutting off any other body part, at least. I'd rather a little finger than other things. So, um, so section 17, here we go. Self depends on consciousness. Self is that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of, whether spiritual or material, simple or compounded, it matters not, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. So what's interesting here at the start, Locke is saying, self is consciousness in whatever way that is determined to be. So if that's an immaterial soul, that's what and that's where consciousness is, that's self. If it is simply the working of the central nervous system, that's where consciousness is, then that is self. Okay, so consciousness and self are integral. They're always connected, no matter what, and if that's in a physical form, then that's what it takes. If that's in a non-physical form, then so be it. Okay. Uh, um, thus, Everyone finds that whilst comprehended under that consciousness, the little finger is as much a part of himself as what is most so. Upon separation of this little finger, should this consciousness go along with the little finger and leave the rest of the body, it is evident the little finger would be the same person and self, then would have nothing to do with the rest of the body. Okay, so again, like I said before, imagine a little finger's cut off. Consciousness goes along with this little finger. That's where the self has gone. The self is actually inhabited within the little finger. Okay. As in this case, it is the consciousness that goes along with the substance, when one part is separate from another, which makes the same person and constitutes this inseparable self. So it is in reference to substances remote in time. That with which the consciousness of this present thinking thing can join itself makes the same person, and is one self with it, and with nothing else, and so attributes to itself and owns all the actions of that thing as its own as far as that consciousness reaches, and no further, as everyone who reflects will perceive. The real point of this section that Locke is pointing out is that across time idea, because the inevitable question we get is, well, am I the same person I was when I was young if I remember it, even though I've physically changed? For Locke, yes. So whatever your consciousness is, either that was in the physical thing that was there when you were young and it's continued to be in the physical thing that you are now, or if it's a non-physical thing, well, it was there connected to your body when you were young and it's there connected to your body now. Okay? The only time we can say that a past physical you wasn't actually the self is when it has no conscious link to the self. Okay, so hopefully Locke's starting to make a lot of sense. He is certainly sticking to his guns. He's not changing his tune at all. We'll have one more recording for Locke to finish him off, and that will be the end of the personal identity unit. So hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully it's clear. Bring your questions to class. Like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.